At 1:12 a.m. local time, the most important casualty in this war may not be a ship, a base, or a battalion. It may be the thing every ceasefire depends on and every escalation destroys, the off-ramp. Reports and headlines circulating tonight suggest Iran has rejected Vance's final offer. The last package meant to keep a ceasefire framework alive or to restart talks before the next cycle of pressure returns. If that rejection is accurate, it doesn't automatically mean the war resumes at full intensity tomorrow morning. But it does mean something more dangerous. The negotiation window is narrowing, and when the window narrows, every actor starts moving like the next phase is inevitable. That is how wars come back, not with one announcement, but with a shift in behavior. Because the moment a final offer is rejected, the conflict changes category. It moves from still negotiable to pre-escalation. It becomes a game of timelines, credibility, and leverage. It becomes a race to decide who gets blamed for the collapse, who gets to claim restraint, and who gets to enter the next phase with the strongest posture. And in a multi-front conflict where shipping lanes, proxies, and infrastructure risk already sit close to the edge, that shift is not political theater. It is operational. So tonight, I'm going to explain what this actually means, beyond the headline. It means the U.S. side is signaling it has reached the end of its current negotiating flexibility, or wants Iran to believe it has. It means Tehran is signaling that the proposed terms do not meet its minimum threshold for credibility, security, or dignity, and that it is willing to accept the risks of continued pressure rather than accept a framework it considers strategically dangerous. It means the ceasefire, if one exists on paper or in partial behavior, is now vulnerable to the fastest killer of all, a violation narrative. And it means the next 48-72 hours will be less about diplomatic language and more about whether militaries, markets, and side fronts begin behaving as if escalation is returning. Let's start with the simplest question that matters. What is a final offer in this kind of war? A final offer is rarely final. It's a pressure device. It is used to create a deadline psychology, accept now or pay later. It is designed to compress decision-making by telling the other side, the next version will not be better. It will be harsher, or it will not exist at all. But the phrase becomes strategically significant the moment it is publicly framed as rejected, because rejection triggers two immediate dynamics. First, it locks narratives. If Iran rejected, then Washington can frame the next escalation as unavoidable, defensive, and forced. If Iran says the offer was unacceptable or untrustworthy, Tehran can frame the next escalation as necessary and coerced. Second, it narrows domestic political space. Once leaders publicly signal, we offered a deal and they rejected, compromise becomes harder. You can still negotiate, but it becomes politically costly to look like you're returning with a softer version of something you just described as final. That is why final offers are often followed by escalation steps. Not always because escalation is the best option, but because leaders become trapped by credibility and narrative. Now, let's talk about what Iran rejecting an offer most likely means in practical terms. In conflicts like this, rejection almost always comes down to one of three things. Definitions. What counts as a ceasefire violation? What fronts are included? What is excluded? What is allowed as self-defense? Definitions are where ceasefires die because each side wants freedom of action and protection from blame at the same time. Sequencing. Who moves first? Iran may demand that strikes stop before it accepts constraints. The U.S. may demand that Iran's pressure tools stop first before it reduces posture. If neither side trusts the other to reciprocate, sequencing becomes a stalemate. Verification and guarantees. Iran may require guarantees the U.S. cannot politically or legally provide. The U.S. may require verification Iran considers humiliating or strategically intrusive. If the gap sits here, the offer fails, not because of emotion, but because the mechanism cannot be made credible. So when you hear rejected, what you're really hearing is the mechanism didn't clear the minimum credibility threshold. And credibility is everything, because ceasefires are not signed into existence. They are enforced into existence by trust, plus verification, plus consequences. Without those three, a ceasefire becomes a temporary pause that collapses on the first incident. Now zoom out. Why does this matter right now? Because the war environment has already shifted into systems pressure territory, shipping risk, infrastructure threats, side fronts, proxy dynamics. That means when diplomacy fails, escalation doesn't return as one clean strike cycle. It returns as a multi-domain pressure campaign where each side tries to impose cost while denying responsibility for starting it. That is exactly why a final offer rejection is dangerous. It gives every side a story to tell when the first new incident happens. And the first new incident is what decides whether the door is fully closed. The real danger, the violation pretext phase. When negotiations fail, ceasefires don't always collapse immediately. Sometimes there is a short period where both sides claim the ceasefire still exists, while simultaneously preparing for escalation. That period is the most fragile phase of all because it produces a specific temptation. Use a limited incident to justify a larger response while claiming the other side broke the deal. This is the violation pretext phase. It has a predictable pattern. One ambiguous incident occurs, a strike, a drone, a maritime harassment event, a proxy action. Both sides rush to narrative control. Each claims the other violated. First escalation follows in response. That pattern thrives in multi-front wars because attribution is contested and because side actors can act independently or be framed as independent. So the question is not only, did Iran reject? The question is, what kind of environment does that rejection create? It creates an environment where the next incident has a higher probability of producing escalation than it did a week ago. Now, why does the phrase ceasefire window is slamming shut fit this moment? Because ceasefire windows are not measured in days on a calendar. They are measured in the number of incidents the system can absorb before it snaps. When talks are alive, both sides have an incentive to absorb a small incident and continue talking. When talks are dead, both sides have an incentive to treat a small incident as confirmation that escalation is necessary. That is the difference between a system drifting toward stability and a system drifting back toward war. And according to the framing implied by final offer rejected, we are drifting back toward the second. The Islamabad factor, why location matters even after rejection. If these negotiations were linked to Pakistan as a channel or venue, the rejection also changes the role of intermediaries. Intermediaries matter most when two things are true. Private contact still exists. Public positions have hardened. That is often exactly what happens after a final offer moment. Publicly, leaders act like the door closed. Privately, they keep a narrow channel open in case escalation becomes too costly. But that narrow channel becomes harder to use after public rejection because any compromise can be framed as weakness. So intermediaries are now likely shifting from building a deal to preventing a spiral. That is a lower ambition, but sometimes a more realistic one. Defense math. Why both sides fear being played after a rejected offer. Here's the defense math sitting under this moment. The side trying to maintain stability pays continuously. Interceptors, patrol hours, ISR flights, naval escorts, readiness cycles, political attention. The side trying to create leverage can often pay less to create uncertainty. Timed threats, limited attacks, proxy pressure, or maritime incidents that do not close a choke point but make it feel risky enough for markets to react. If a final offer is rejected, Washington worries about this. Iran may use time and ambiguity to keep the U.S. paying the cost of stability while refusing to accept constraints. Iran worries about the mirror image. The U.S. may use a ceasefire framework to restrict Iran's ability to respond while preserving its own freedom to apply pressure, strike selectively, or tighten economic constraints. So both sides fear asymmetry. Both sides call it trust. And once trust becomes publicly broken, the ceasefire becomes structurally weak. That is why escalation risk rises even before the next missile is launched. What the U.S. is likely trying to accomplish now. If Washington is framing an offer as final and rejected, the next move is usually about credibility and leverage. Washington will likely want to achieve four things. Show that rejection carries consequences, maintain Allied confidence that the U.S. still controls the strategy, prevent Iran from interpreting rejection as proof the U.S. will tolerate endless stalling, keep open a narrow channel so escalation doesn't become uncontrolled. That requires a careful balance. Increase pressure without triggering uncontrolled regional blowback. In practice, that often means a combination of posture and selective action rather than a single dramatic strike, because dramatic strikes create dramatic reactions. But the risk is that selective pressure can still trigger major responses if it hits the wrong category of target or if it intersects with domestic politics in Tehran. What Iran is likely trying to accomplish now, if Iran has rejected what is being framed as the last offer, Tehran's next objective is deterrence management. It needs to show that it cannot be coerced by deadlines. It needs to avoid looking like it refused peace for the sake of refusal, and it needs to preserve the ability to escalate if pressure increases, while avoiding a move that unifies international opinion against it. That usually produces a posture of controlled defiance, harsh public language, defensive framing, selective signals of capability, and pressure options held in reserve for moments of maximum impact. The key is the phrase, moments of maximum impact. Iran's strategic behavior in similar environments has historically shown a tendency to time capability use for political effect, not just tactical effect. If that logic holds here, then the next major move may be timed not to the calendar, but to the diplomatic narrative, a moment when the U.S. is most constrained or when an incident can produce maximum leverage. That is exactly what makes the next 48-72 hours sensitive. It's not the size of action, it's the timing and the narrative. The global consequence layer, shipping, oil, and the choke point psychology. Once talks fail, markets stop pricing possible stability, and start pricing possible disruption. That doesn't require a full maritime crisis. It requires credible uncertainty. If there's any renewed discussion of maritime enforcement, blockades, inspections, or denial regimes, whether targeted at Hormuz or at ports, the global system reacts first and asks questions later. Insurers raise premiums. Shipping firms adjust routes. Energy traders price in risk. Gulf states raise alert posture. That's why diplomacy failure is not a diplomatic event. It's a system event. And that is what a competitor-style analysis should always translate. The war is not only what explodes, it is what becomes uncertain. The spoiler risk after a rejected offer. Every negotiation failure increases spoiler incentive. Spoilers can be proxy groups who fear peace will reduce their relevance political factions, who benefit from continued confrontation, commanders who believe escalation is necessary, third parties who want the talks to fail for strategic reasons. A spoiler does not need to carry out a large attack. It needs one incident at the wrong time to force either side to walk away permanently. When a final offer is rejected, leaders are already primed to interpret incidents as bad faith. That makes spoiler action more valuable because it is more likely to succeed. This is why the post-rejection period is inherently unstable. The real question, is the door actually closed? Even when leaders call something a final offer, the reality is usually more complicated. The door is closed publicly to preserve leverage. But behind the scenes, doors are rarely sealed completely because states understand escalation creates unpredictable cost. So the better question is, what is the system doing? Is the system moving toward procedural management, hotlines, deconfliction, verification language? Or is the system moving toward punitive posture, threats, scheduled enforcement, widened target discussions? That behavioral shift is how you know whether the war is coming back. What happens next? Watch list, 48-72 hours. If you want to track whether escalation is returning, watch these signals. Watch 1. Language changes. If officials shift toward consequence language, retaliation, unleash, no more patience, that's escalation preparation. If they shift toward procedural language, technical teams, monitoring power framework, contacts continue, that's an attempt to keep a narrow channel alive. Watch 2. Tempo and posture. Does operational tempo change? Do patrol patterns intensify? Do alerts rise? Do we see visible repositioning? War returns first as posture. Watch 3. Maritime and market indicators, premiums, reroutes, port delays, volatility. Markets often detect escalation risk before governments admit it. Watch 4. Side front temperature. Proxy fronts, border exchanges, and unattributed incidents are the easiest way for escalation to restart while maintaining plausible blame. If edges heat up, the center will follow. Watch 5. Attribution behavior. If every incident is immediately blamed and amplified, the system is priming for escalation. If incidents are quietly handled, the system may still be trying to hold the line. Watch 6. Intermediary signals. Any indication that intermediaries remain active suggests the door is not fully closed, even if the public narrative says it is. Bottom line, if Iran rejected what is being framed as Vance's last offer, that does not guarantee the war resumes at full scale tomorrow. But it does mean the ceasefire window, if it existed, is now structurally weaker. It means the next incident is more likely to escalate. It means both sides will begin shaping blame narratives. And it means the system, markets, shipping, posture, proxies, will start reacting as if a return to conflict is more probable. In one line, a rejected final offer doesn't end diplomacy, it changes the incentives so that escalation becomes easier to justify and harder to stop. Watch the next 48-72 hours. The decisive story won't be what anyone announces. It will be what the system begins doing, whether posture tightens, whether maritime risk prices rise, whether edges flare, and whether procedural channels survive the first shock. Because wars don't come back all at once. They come back when the off-ramp becomes too narrow for anyone to use without losing face.